Hello, and welcome to today's Cato Policy Forum on the opportunity cost of state AI policy. My name is Jennifer Huddleston, and I'm a Senior Fellow in Technology Policy here at the Cato Institute. I'm very excited to host this timely and relevant conversation, both as it relates to a paper that we released earlier this week on the exact question of the opportunity cost of state AI policy, as well as the fact that this conversation is occurring at a time where we're seeing a debate over a potential federal moratorium on state AI policy, and also at a time where we've seen over 1,000 bills related to AI introduced in state legislatures across the country. So needless to say, there's a lot to discuss, and I'm excited to have an excellent panel of experts as it relates to this issue. I'll introduce our panelists in just a second, but I want to make sure to let our audience know that we will be taking questions both from here in our auditorium as well as online. If you're joining us online, you may join the conversation and submit your questions directly on the event webpage or via Facebook, YouTube, or X. If you're here in the auditorium, when we turn to Q&A at the end, we will have microphones coming to you, so please wait for me to acknowledge you and for someone with a microphone to come to you. But to get started, I want to introduce our three panelists. To my immediate right is Joshua Levine, who is the author of the paper that I mentioned on the opportunity cost of state AI policy. Joshua is also a research fellow with the Foundation for American Innovation, where his work focuses on digital competition, interoperability, online expression, and the governance of emerging technologies. His most recent research explores the national security implications of telecom infrastructure, cross-border flows for AI development, and regulatory approaches to big tech platforms. His work has appeared in various publications in the tech policy sphere, including Tech Policy Press, Broadband Breakfast, and Rebuilding Tech. Next, we have Tatiana Rice, who is the Director of U.S. AI Legislation for the Future of Privacy Forum. In this role, she serves to lead the organization's engagement with state and federal lawmakers on artificial intelligence policy. She has provided expert analysis and guidance to help policymakers, industry leaders, and civil society navigate the complex and rapidly evolving landscape of AI governance. And finally, we have Matt Middlestedt, who's a Technology Policy Research Fellow here at the Cato Institute. Matt's research focuses on the intersection of policy, cybersecurity, and emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence and quantum computing. His work has appeared in a variety of publications, including The Hill, National Review, and his Substack is Digital Spirits. So to start with, I mentioned this is based on a recent paper that we published here at the Cato Institute. Josh, you wrote this paper on the potential opportunity cost of state AI policy, which is a bit of a different framing perhaps than we've seen around this conversation. It's something really focused on the potential benefits that may be foregone rather than just looking at the potential risk or harm that we might see policy seeking to address. Can you tell us a little bit about your paper?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Before I start, I just want to say thank you to Jennifer, to the whole Cato Institute team, publications who not only made this event, but made the paper possible. I'm really fortunate to be able to be here to chat with you all about this today. So my paper, I really wanted to answer two questions. The first is, what can, should, and is being done related to AI and regulation? And why should we as Americans and as people generally care about this issue? I think the answer to the latter is the opportunity cost of overregulation or misregulating AI, broadly as technology, are all of the benefits and the future products and services that we will forego and not have access to as Americans. That potentially means fewer new medical innovations. It means reduced total factor productivity, which is oftentimes linked with economic growth and prosperity. It means that we are not going to be leading on the technological frontier. That adoption curve, this question of how quickly can a society take this innovation and put it into their lives to do good, is highly correlated and has a lot of evidence. There's a lot of evidence that shows that's vital for maintaining, leadership not only in the world economically, culturally, but I also think, from a national security standpoint as well. So to look at what is being done, I think it's really important to start with thinking about AI as a general purpose technology. I like to think of this as it's a force multiplier, much like the steam engine, electricity, kind of the internet increasingly. These things are platforms that enable new innovations and new technologies to be developed on top of them. They enable new products, new inventions, new interactions, frankly, among people. So thinking about how GPTs have traditionally been regulated, usually, we split that between federal, state governments, and then municipal governments. This is the system of federalism that we have in this country. At the federal level, there are two specific aspects that I think are important. There's the Commerce Clause in the Constitution and the Supremacy Clause. And this matters because the Commerce Clause states the federal government is in charge of regulating interstate commerce. In my paper, I think I use the example of, someone in Iowa grows corn and sends it across the border to Louisiana to make popcorn. AI, as a digital technology, is constantly being used across state borders all the time, whether that's the data center that you are sending your information to, the data center that AI model is trained on, and the inference, which is the output, actually what you see come out of a model, whether it comes to the data that's being collected and moving around, which I'm sure Tatiana will have something to say about later as an expert on this. There's a lot of things that are happening across state lines. And so when you put up barriers in individual states or have mismatched regulations, this can limit those flows and creates problems between the states. That's where the federal government steps in. Now, the next is the Supremacy Clause. This states that federal government, when they make a law about something, that becomes the law of the land. We set one national standard. This isn't always proper, but it was, I think, one of the leading reasons why the U.S. has been a leader in the digital space to now. We had the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which deregulated quite a bit of the telecommunications industry and allowed the early internet to flourish. We also had the Internet Tax Freedom Act, which prevented new ad valorem taxes and additional taxation on internet operations in those early days. This enabled our networks to grow, it enabled platforms to pop up, and it enabled everyday people to take advantage of this new communications platform, which we now know is all around us, and you can see whether it's in the stock market, whether it's in our phones, whether many of you watching online today are able to, to access and see this content. The federal government has, there's been kind of, I think, a misnomer that the federal government is asleep at the wheel on AI, or they're not doing anything on tech. I just don't really see that personally. We've seen in the 118th Congress, there were more than 100 bills introduced. Not a ton of them passed, but there was a lot of legislative action. The Senate had AI Insight Forums, which were closed-door events, kind of keeping things within, bringing in experts to hear about what's happening. The House had their bipartisan AI task force. One of the recommendations which came out of that, led by Representative Obernolte of California and Representative Liu, also of California, was that we may need preemption. We need a moratorium because we were seeing divergence in the states. You also saw executive branch action. The Biden administration put out the longest executive order in the history of the United States, which would regulate AI in all host of ways. Was seen by some as an attempt at regulatory capture, some seen as an overstepping of the executive branch compared to the congressional branch. But that was obviously been repealed. The Trump administration is taking a different tack on AI policy. They want to promote AI dominance. They want to promote American AI, which I think are all very, laudable and important goals to have. And they are currently going through their own rulemakings and own directions to every executive agency about how AI can be leveraged to support the services that we provide to Americans. Now let's look at the states. Jen made a great point. There's more than 1,000 bills currently pending in state legislatures across the country. We've seen some of them pass already. We have also seen in 2023 and 2024, there probably were also around 1,000 bills introduced. We've seen, so we've seen all these bills introduced, and where are states kind of traditionally poised to regulate, I think is the right question here. We have there's places like taxation, there's places like, personal liability and tort law. There's areas such as land use regulation, occupational licensing, types of qualifications and requirements that we need to have for to have certain jobs. Thank you. Pardon me. And so we've seen a lot of this action in the states. There's a lot of opportunity there, but there's also potentially some harms. I like to categorize these kind of in three big buckets, I would say, of state bills so far that we've seen. There are kind of regulatory audits, fact-finding studies. These are states, I think up to at least 30 states now, have passed various bills to either look at what their current regulatory kind of schedule looks like, what laws they currently have available to them, how should they start thinking about using AI, whether it's in their own regulatory action or it's like to regulate further. I think having that information, bringing that in is very important, and I'm really thrilled to see states doing that. The second is dealing with kind of potentially harmful outputs. So this is mainly been focused on things like deepfakes, non-consensual intimate imagery. So thinking about fake pornography, essentially synthetic pornography of people, sometimes of children, which I think everyone can agree is pretty gruesome and awful, and we don't want to see any of that happening. Also an area where the federal government has actually been quite active. Recently signed into law the Take It Down Act, which would criminalize the publication and the hosting of such content. There's also No Fakes Act, which is a law that is still being worked around. And the third, kind of, in my opinion, potentially most harmful layer of AI regulation is AI model development regulations. So these would be laws, generally ex ante laws. So before you can put a product or a technology out into the world, you have to comply with a series of audits, requirements. There's additional testing you have to go through. There's oftentimes state agencies that are stood up that all they will do will essentially be working with companies and watching and seeing what you do when you're developing the technology, but it also puts burdens on deployers. So I think this is kind of an interesting thing, right? Because you're gonna have people who are building AI models. So you think of the leading labs, you think of research universities, people are building their own AIs. Those people are going to be developers. They're also gonna be deployers. They're gonna be putting these models out, putting them to work, using them in their daily course of life. But small businesses and individuals, probably like many of you, ideally, will have your own models that you're going to be working on either locally or you're going to be accessing. That means that you're also theoretically, potentially, going to have to comply with these additional regulations. This, to me, really could slow down what we see as the diffusion across the economy. We think about a colleague of mine, Sam Hammond, has kind of an axis that he likes to show, which is like the research kind of development curve, which is looking on the x-axis or the y-axis, and the x-axis is diffusion. We can do a lot of research, we can push cutting edge things, which we absolutely should be doing. But none of that really matters if people aren't using the technology and learning how to use it effectively amongst themselves. Where model level regulation, especially at the state level, come in and potentially can be harmful is it slows down that kind of diffusion. I think there are two state bills I point at in my paper that are most emblematic of this. There's the Colorado bill, which was signed into law by Governor Polis last year. And then there's also Utah's kind of AI regulatory framework and policy bill. The Colorado law is kind of formatted and based to be mainly ex ante regulation. After being signed, it would require algorithmic assessments, third-party auditing testing, specifically around high impact uses. So generally uses that you would see in places like healthcare, in finance, education, things that people would generally think of as sectors that maybe could use a little bit more disruption or a little bit more efficiency. But that law is now already trying to be amended. It's been postponed. There have been a lot of concerns, particularly from the startup community and small innovators, that they're not going to be able to comply with the law, and that's something that's ongoing. Alternatively, you have Utah. Utah set out to inform their own state agencies around how AI could be used to their benefit. They also have created kind of a pilot sandbox program where if you're a company or an individual who wants to use or try to use an AI in a specific way, but you feel like there's a regulatory barrier, you can go to the state and say, hey, here's my problem. Here's the very narrow slice of regulation that I'd like you to forbear me from and prevent from me being liable to. Let's do a pilot program for a year and see how it goes. And Utah then collects that information and it uses it to inform future legislative action so that we can ensure there's a balance between what's actually helping people, helping their constituents realize what they would like to do or build new technologies while still having some form or modicum of protection. Everything else in the law still applies. So I think those are kind of the two I see as kind of the two paths. One of them is a more permissive path, one that is looking to make it easier for people to build and deploy these technologies, one that wants to kind of put regulatory burdens in place, and I'll talk about why that's a little bit potentially pernicious. There are three kind of areas that I think we see regulation potentially causing problems. The first is hindered AI diffusion. As I've explained to you, I think the opportunity cost of this stuff is all of the amazing opportunities and products we won't be able to see come out. The second is kind of getting into this lane of, I think what some people like to term as the precautionary principle. This is something you've heard lots of folks in the tech sector talk about as Europe's great flaw right now. The reason there aren't any European companies is because they're too quick to regulate. They put too many broad, potentially onerous regulations in their companies. And so people just end up saying, I'm not going to work to comply with this. I'd rather go somewhere else. Thankfully, it's usually the United States where they come. And that's why we've seen 35 of the top 40 technology companies by market cap right now are American companies. We see 165% more venture capital investment in our companies here in the United States than we do in Europe. When you look at overall unicorn rates, the United States is far and away the leader. And I think part of that is our regulatory framework and the way that we are permissive to new innovations. Right? The third and final is regulatory capture and rent seeking. These are terms, I think probably if you're a Cato Institute audience, maybe you're more familiar with them, but for everyone, this is the idea that when you pass new regulation, the folks who are generally best positioned to not only comply, but influence that regulation are incumbents and people who have existing access to government, who have played the game. They're used to going to legislators, they're used to working with regulators, they build a program that benefits themselves and helps lock out new competition. I think this is a real concern. If you look at the companies who have been the most supportive of some of these larger model regulations, they are entrenched incumbents. They are people who've been around a long time. Microsoft, for example, IBM, these are people who were pretty okay with Colorado law. The people who are not okay with it are small startups, venture capitalists, researchers, people who are trying to find ways to unleash this technology for the better and to create new things, create disruption. And I think that that's really important. We saw California had a bill last year, SB 1047, which was supported by several of the leading AI labs. Who it wasn't supported by was by Stanford University researchers. It wasn't supported by individual creators and smaller mom and pop businesses who stood to potentially lose out and see themselves kind of cut off from this next wave of innovation and potential prosperity. So. Kind of the last, I hope that gives you a little bit of overview of the paper. I would appreciate everyone reading it and look forward to the conversation today.
And if you're joining us online, the link to the paper is on the event page. And if you're joining us here in person, there are copies available outside the auditorium. Tatiana and Matt, I know you both have had an opportunity to read the paper before today's event. I was wondering if you could share a little bit of your thoughts. What particularly resonated with you? And was there anything that you might think about a little bit differently or might have a different point of view on? And I'll start with you, Tatiana.
Sure. And first, thank you, Cato Institute, and Jennifer for having me, and Josh, of course, for sharing your paper ahead of time. I do think right now there is a lot of conversation around AI, and oftentimes it ends up falling into really black and white conversations, and there is actually a lot of nuance and meaningful conversations that should happen, and I'm really happy to be able to be here and have that and be part of this, because there are a lot of aspects of this paper that I did appreciate. So one of the big things, and Josh, you actually already talked about this, is the focus on AI diffusion. I think we hear a lot about AI innovation, AI innovation, AI innovation, and yes, technological development is extremely important, but that technological development isn't going to best enhance society and make us better if it isn't getting diffused into society, if it isn't getting diffused into the healthcare sector, into the education sector, into the employment sector. So again, the focus on diffusion, I actually think is the right analysis to do, and I do think you need to be able to focus both on the innovation and the diffusion aspect. It is the question, of course, of what makes diffusion happen best, right? And so I do think you do a really good job of looking at the trade-offs of both sides. You do look at the fact that these states are the laboratories of democracy, and oftentimes they are closer to their constituents, and survey after survey after survey does show that consumers are concerned about AI. They do have really valid concerns about AI fraud, about deepfakes, about how AI is being used in their healthcare, in their insurance, et cetera. And so states feel the need to fill that regulatory vacuum, given that so far right now, the federal government has not had any kind of preemptive law that creates a uniform standard. And we've seen that for a long time in data privacy. There is always that concern of the patchwork of state privacy regulations, which definitely has been a thing, but it isn't by far as difficult or as patchwork as people have said, where California was the first to enact a state privacy law, and people saw the effect of, okay, we actually don't want to take that approach. And we've seen over time now that the states have kind of started to coordinate around a uniform approach through these different types of mechanisms, looking at each other and coordinating. But I do also really like that you do look at these trade-offs, because as a state-by-state approach is not beneficial when AI is using data from different states to be able to train the models. The developer might be in one state, the integrator might be in a different state, the deployer might be in a different state. There's a lot of different components of the tech stack that often do happen across different types of state lines. So there is a genuine tension that I think would be impossible for anybody to ignore. And I do also appreciate the focus on what you call a restrained regulatory approach. I think, again, going back to what I said earlier, oftentimes the conversation can really be black and white, either no regulation or it's EU-style regulation. And there's actually a lot of middle ground in the middle of that, including your focus on the Utah regulatory sandbox, which I actually think also does a good job of acknowledging, hey, there are risks. We want to mitigate these risks. Consumers are concerned about, in Utah, they're focused on mental health chatbots and how kids use these tools. And let's create a way for companies to continue to innovate, but we're also going to have ways to ensure that they are doing the right thing to mitigate risks and to create some kind of governance framework. And so I appreciated all of those different aspects of the paper. That said, I think the analysis I would really like to see generally, and I haven't seen anybody do yet, is what is the cost of inaction? Not what is the benefit of regulation, but what is the cost of using existing regulatory structures to be able to address these AI governance questions. So I think most people do agree that things like tort law, contract law, consumer protection, civil rights, data privacy do apply to AI, but what that actually means in practice and implementation is wildly unclear. And so actually that business uncertainty about how do we do this in a way that is legal actually does have financial and economic risk associated with it. And we were just talking about before I was in a policy role, I used to be a practicing attorney, working at a law firm, doing a lot of litigation and compliance work on behalf of companies under the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act, which has a right of action associated with it. I have seen time and time again that the courts are not good tech policy venues. And so in the absence of explicit legislative standards about what does it mean for an AI system to have the correct AI governance framework in place and risk mitigation measures in place, the courts will just make it up. And that isn't oftentimes the best mechanism. So I do wonder if even if we don't have a patchwork of state laws, we will still end up having a patchwork of case law, a patchwork of different types of tort law and data privacy law, where I think there are ways to be able to address both of these in a more uniform way. And I think I do agree that there is definitely a cost of regulation really hindering small businesses and small developers, but I do think there's also a cost on small deployers. At FPF, we do oftentimes work across a lot of different industries and talking to a lot of different types of lawyers who represent small mom and pop shops, small school districts, small healthcare companies. And oftentimes they actually don't know that they're using AI, let alone do they know that oftentimes in their contracts they're taking on the liability for any harm caused. And so that is a big cost for a lot of the issues regarding AI diffusion into society as well. So I do think that there should be a good conversation and question and analysis of what is the opportunity cost of state policy and what is the opportunity cost of litigation and enforcement through existing law.
Matt, I want to bring you into the conversation. You joined us here at Cato a few months ago, focusing on questions related to AI. But I know you've been thinking about these questions much more broadly. And since before you joined us here as a research fellow, what were your thoughts? Were there things that particularly resonated with some of the research you've been doing and anything that you kind of had questions or further thoughts about?
First of all, I just want to say I very much appreciated the piece. Honestly, does a great rundown of some of the big costs, I think that we should really be thinking about when thinking about this patchwork both of you have mentioned. There are real risks, and we do need to get this right because it's truly an important technology. Now, in terms of thinking about the work, I really do want to focus in on just one of the opportunity costs you mentioned. The first one, hindered AI diffusion. This has come up a couple times. The reason being, I think this is truly the most important cost we need to be thinking about with all these things. The other things, of course, are very important. I'd love to get into them if there was a bit more time, but diffusion, I think, is so critical. I guess, first of all, just to make sure we are all on the same page here, this can be a bit jargony sometimes. Diffusion basically refers to the process of taking technology that's sometimes just sitting on the laboratory shelf, collecting dust, endlessly being tested, and actually putting it out there so people can creatively start to toy with it, experiment, figure out how it might be useful for productivity, and actually start yielding some AI impact. It's the translation of possibility into impact. Now, in your paper, largely, and I think rightfully, you talk about how lost diffusion, if we incur this cost, that's basically going to be a GDP cost. We're taking an economic hit. We're not going to have, per your example, advanced manufacturing or automated ports. Or one example I love to give, automated drug discovery, which could help so many people if we were just like shooting out new drugs all the time using AI techniques that can discover these things. That could be truly huge for our society, and the benefits for health, for productivity, for all of your bottom lines, that could be absolutely massive. Now, one thing, if I were to co-author, add a few things, I'd add on this topic is that I think AI diffusion is not necessarily just about productivity, but I think critically to, your points as well, it's also about safety. Right now, a lot of the emerging AI technologies that we're seeing are not actually about productivity enhancements. They're about improving things that are currently unsafe, that we as humans, when we're in charge, just are not doing well and are doing very unsafely. A great example of this is driverless vehicles. Right now, humans, everyone in this room knows, we're terrible at driving. We're always on our phones, we're sleepy, we're distracted, we're singing music, what have you, we're aggressive. And as a result of that, a lot of people are dying. Every year in the United States, about 44,000 people die in car accidents, which amounts to about 500,000 people over a decade. 500,000 people, which is a huge toll. Most people in this room will at least hear of somebody who has died in a car accident, which is a terrible thing and something that we should bend over backwards to avoid if we can. Now, in terms of this safety problem, thankfully there's an AI for that. Driverless cars, right now, if you don't know, are just kind of turning that corner from possibility into reality. Right now, Waymo, Google's driverless car cab company, is actually operational in many cities across this country, and very soon are going to be deploying in DC, if you people in the audience didn't know. We're going to have these driverless cars on the street. Now, not only are driverless cars real and actively solving this problem in small numbers right now, but if you actually look at the safety statistics of these things, we're seeing quite a compelling story. A recent study I read from Swiss Re, an insurer, they looked into Waymo's traffic reports or accident reports, and what they found was a 93% reduction in bodily harm claims. 93%. Honestly, I don't think in my lifetime I've heard of any other safety innovation that has that type of record. That is truly a day and night change for safety. And in terms of this conversation about opportunity costs and diffusion, productivity is essential, but this type of thing, in terms of all these regulations that are intended to help safety, this is safety we could forgo if we get this wrong. This is safety that these 500,000 people I've mentioned, these people could lose their lives if we create an excessively regulated state, a patchwork that doesn't allow this type of technology, and we really need to be careful about that because this stuff's real. These numbers are fantastic, and I think we need to do what we can to seize this moment.
Yeah, thank you. Before we turn to my questions for the whole panel and to the audience questions, Josh, I just want to give you a couple of minutes here if there's anything in our commentators' comments that you want to respond to.
Sure, yeah, I'll be very brief. To Matt's point, that was first, I'm a huge fan of Waymo, and I think I love that example. I think that's absolutely correct, and I'm very, very excited to see them here starting in 2026. To Tatiana's point, I appreciated all the thoughtful comments you had, and I think I think your point around this nuance of regulation, like there has to be some kind of middle ground here, is true, and I think it's something that everyone is searching for. I think you're correct that you look at the numbers, you look at polling related to how Americans are feeling about AI, there's a lot of optimism, but there's also a lot of uncertainty. And so it is important for both us as policy professionals, but legislators, just kind of folks in the media, people who are building these technologies, to be transparent and forthcoming with the public, and be very honest about like what the goal is, how the technology is going to either make your life better, make you safer, create new opportunities for you, but also be realistic that like there will be disruption. Like there will be periods of time where there is things that are unsettling. There will be problems. It's not going to be perfect. But I think, to your point also, we need to be very careful and be very thoughtful about how we craft those laws so that we create the opportunities while still finding that narrow cone, as it were. Excited to hear further questions.
So I have a couple of thoughts from my own reading of the paper and kind of questions for conversation for our panelists. Josh, one of the things your paper discusses is that there are these other elements that have traditionally been a state role that could actually impact how friendly a state is to AI innovation or to AI diffusion, things like the way the tax system works or the way products liability works. We've also seen a lot of conversation around the way existing law may apply. Tatiana, you brought this up some in your comments as well. I was wondering if I could get the panelists' thoughts of, if states aren't thinking about doing AI-specific regulation, are there ways that a state might knowingly or unknowingly encourage or discourage AI innovation through these things that have been more traditionally a state role?
Sure. There are three off the top of my head that I think are important. One is education. We have a lot of conversations. People are constantly seeing the numbers of students who aren't prepared to do math work beyond high school. Reading scores are down across the country. Education, ensuring our kids are not only able to use and deploy this technology to serve them, so it empowers them is important, but also that we have people who are able to build the next generation of these technologies and become, the next great material scientist or the next engineer or the next poet or the next playwright, right? The second would be zoning and land use. I think that's a conversation that's increasingly being had in DC, which plays into energy policy. Data centers are being built. One of the reasons Virginia is Data Center Alley now is because of its zoning rules and generally pretty lax zoning rules for building data centers, and its quick and clear approval timelines. If you're interested in learning more about some of this, my colleague Thomas Hockman and Emmett Penny have a state permitting playbook, so you can look through and see how good is your state on getting new energy infrastructure, but also general buildings started and going. That will have a massive impact on like where AI really is actually being developed and where businesses can leverage it well. And I would say the third is going to be just general public infrastructure and investment. We talk a lot about like digital public infrastructure, about having accessibility to broadband, having accessibility to to compute, accessing the power and the resources that you need to train AI models and to develop your own model and actually play around with these things and learn how they're used. And I think those are all things the states can be doing and should be doing and thinking about.
Tatiana and Matt, any thoughts on what states might be doing in a non-AI policy sense that could be really impactful for AI?
Yeah, I do think there has been a little bit of a movement on workforce development, right? So there is a lot of research that shows how AI is going to be displacing a lot of jobs. And of course, the best way to be able to address that is for state lawmakers and policymakers to be able to create programs and incentives and investments into how do we train this next generation, not only to be capitalizing on AI and the way that it's really going to transform our society, but also making sure that they have a good idea of like, okay, we're going to make an AI system that does follow the data privacy law that we already have in our state, right? So being able to have those kind of workforce development programs, I do think is really important. The second one, I think, goes to the lack of clarity that's currently in the ecosystem right now, which is through either attorney general guidance of existing law to AI. A couple different states have done this, including Massachusetts, California, Connecticut, trying to make it more clear for businesses about how they do, from a regulatory perspective, think about the application of these principles to AI. The other one is just more explicit updates to existing law to cover some of these loopholes that have been identified. So again, particularly in the data privacy area, where actually a lot of the questions and governance around AI does come from, because data privacy at its heart is really just about data management, around transparency, around risk assessments, really can come down to a data privacy law as well. We've seen a number of states this year update their data privacy law to ensure that if a company is collecting somebody's personal information to feed it into an AI system that will be making a consequential decision about them, they have to be told about that, right? That kind of core transparency requirement that a lot of consumer advocates are really focused on is starting to be addressed through data privacy laws, and I do think that that is probably a good approach to that issue.
One thing I'd add, so you mentioned like clarity of regulations from the attorneys general, things like that. I'd go one step further and kind of demand of our states and federal government sort of a mapping exercise. I want them to create, maybe even visually, a map of the regulations, who regulates who, what powers exist, how could they be used. And if we have that type of map, I think for industry, for AI, the AI industry or any digital technology industry, this could be very clarifying. If you know what's out there and what could be used, then you'll have the confidence needed to innovate, needed to move forward, especially if you're a small business that doesn't have a lawyer. Having a tool like this to see what's out there and not having to necessarily dig through attorneys general, stuff like that, could be very helpful. Also, on like the safety point, in cases where maybe there are certain agencies that do need to enforce certain regulations or rules, one thing that isn't good, of course, is to have two agencies that we discover regulating the same thing. Because when you have that happen, what doesn't happen is safety regulation. And of course, innovation doesn't happen because there's a swirl. What you get is a court fight. And that's the type of thing that you can ferret out if you go through this process of discovery, what's there, what might apply, and how can we fix those overlaps, how can we identify gaps, and of course, how can we just clarify this law to people so that they can move forward confidently.
You know, there's a bit of an elephant in the room right now, and I kind of mentioned this in my opening. We're having this conversation, if you're watching it at a later date, in June of 2025. In the House version, there was a broad 10-year moratorium on state-level AI policy. In the Senate version, this has now been refined a little bit. There's some things tying it to BEAD funding, but there still is a very pertinent conversation, even though we've all been thinking about this issue and talking about it for quite some time, about the question of a potential federal moratorium, not on AI development, but on state-level AI policy. So to our panel, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this kind of approach that might pause state AI policy, as well as kind of thinking about, okay, if this pushes this conversation to a federal level, and particularly this conversation around the potential opportunity cost of AI policy, are there any lessons learned from the states in what we've seen already that our federal policymakers should be thinking about?
Sure, that's a great question. Your point, very timely. I think first on the moratorium itself, I think that we've seen both a lot of improvements. Support Representative Obernolte and his original drafting and insertion of language, and Chairman Guthrie from ENC, who passed this language at a committee. I think the Cruise staff and the Commerce team is doing really great work on trying to maybe clarify these things a little bit. I think there's still a lot up in the air about what we'll see moving forward. This is a policy that we've engaged on, and I think they've done a lot to clarify exactly. I think the most important thing, actually, if you really look at the moratorium, right, it actually tracks to a lot of the things that we've been discussing on this stage. The moratorium does restrict the type of laws that would recommend against enforcement by states, but I think it also does provide clear areas where states can do good AI regulation. The first is on diffusion, trying to identify pathways and legislative avenues and regulatory approaches that can ensure that AI is diffused and is accessible to people, which, as we've kind of discussed, means there has to be some modicum of safety and some understanding of where liability lies, whether it's with the deployer, the developer, or some other kind of combination of the two. There's also specifically things related to permitting and zoning. So one of the key inputs and ways that we get AI to be accessible to people is that we have the energy to power it and we have the data centers to run the models. So we also, if you're using AI or trying to develop new systems that are relying on artificial intelligence to deploy these kinds of build-outs, it's supportive. It also clarifies that common law, things that are based on the common law, so things that we've built up over years, like product liability, consumer protection liability, tort law, defamation and slander, all of those laws will still apply, as well as federal criminal law. So if you're creating, using AI to drive a car into someone and kill them, you are still going to be liable for doing so, and clarify where the liability lies. So I think that's really important to remember, and I'd recommend people look at the text if you're interested in learning more about this. Speaking to the opportunity cost, I think, there is certainly an opportunity cost that we also create by going to the federal level. Federal bill, making legislation, if you've spent time in DC or even just watch from afar, it's not a, quick, clean, easy process. It's not quite Schoolhouse Rock. You've got a lot of wrangling that happens, and oftentimes it ends up being compromised. And so people have to give on certain things, which, could be a positive outcome, could lead to some things that we don't love, and we actually do forego some of the things we want to see. But I do believe that a federal standard here would be much more preferable than having the patchwork of state laws. So if this piece of legislation pushes us towards that eventual equilibrium, I think it'd be a good thing. Matt
or Tatiana, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, moratorium, I think it's very important to recognize the carve-outs, its success is going to be a function of having carve-outs still enabling us to enforce laws on criminal activity. I think that's very important to emphasize. In terms of the purpose here, though, I think that there is real value in trying to avoid a patchwork of regulations. No matter how well-meaning, all these state laws could end up creating a real problem. I also work in cybersecurity policy on top of artificial intelligence policy, and I love to use this example because this is an area in which we have seen a patchwork. There's a huge patchwork of cyber laws that have developed over the last 10 years or so, and as a result, we have not necessarily seen a solution to these problems, as I'm sure everybody in this audience knows. Cyber attacks are higher than ever before. Now, in terms of specifics, things like transparency, which is an area in which a lot of states have legislated on cybersecurity. Right now, there's about 50 different cyber reporting laws, on top of the 22 at the federal level, making 72 total cyber reporting laws in this country, maybe even more because it's always changing. The result of that hasn't actually been transparency. It's been a mess of data. There's all sorts of databases that are not necessarily unified. There's different ways of measuring what counts as an attack. There's different people, like when you're attacked, you don't necessarily know who you have to report to. And in terms of these questions about safety, transparency, regulation, no one's being served. I was just at a cybersecurity conference yesterday, and one of the big themes was there's no good data. And actually one of the reasons for that is our legislation doesn't allow it. We have this patchwork that has popped up that's undermining our ability to do things securely. And so with artificial intelligence, we really got to get this right. We can't do that. In cyber, there's now bipartisan consensus that this is a problem. And I think that in a few years, maybe there might be bipartisan consensus that something like a moratorium might have actually, if we don't do it, might have actually been a good thing had we struck when the moment was right. So I think we do need to seize this opportunity.
Yeah, we don't really have a perspective of supporting or opposing the moratorium, but what we do have an idea of is the landscape and the practical effects of what that might mean. And I think it actually brings me back to my original point earlier is no matter your affiliation, if a moratorium was to be enacted, there would be backlash. And I think we're already actually starting to see that from a lot of state policymakers who are like, okay, you're gonna do this, I'm gonna keep moving, I'm gonna keep advancing and moving even quicker and maybe even doing crazier things because I wanna make sure that my law gets enacted and then we can fight it out in the courts later. And again, I don't think that that is good for business certainty because the moratorium does not actually have in support with it any kind of uniform standard. And usually when you're talking about a federal standard, a federal preemptive standard, that is also associated with some form of uniform guideline. So it doesn't still solve the problem of creating some level of consistency. It just means, again, that we're going to need to be figuring it all out through the courts, and the state lawmakers are going to continue to try to fight against everything that is happening. And so I think we're going to end up seeing a patchwork of different types of decisions, not only on the moratorium, but then again on the enforcement of existing laws, since the moratorium does carve out kind of these broadly applicable laws. I do want to point out actually something that I think is an interesting theory that I came across actually recently from somebody from AEI, which is if the federal government was to acknowledge choice of law provisions in contracts. So basically it would allow these states to continue with experimenting with different types of AI governance or AI regulatory approaches, but it would be up to the companies to decide basically if they were going to enforce or if they were going to govern under those statutes. So we could genuinely see from a data perspective whether it is better for companies to have governance programs in place and say, hey, we are complying with this law and consumers like that, and therefore, the market kind of wins out that way, as opposed to, other companies who decide we're not going to take any compliance costs, we're just going to kind of move quickly and see, chance litigation and see what happens. I do think that's an interesting approach that maybe might be worth investigating.
Yeah, just to quickly piggyback on that, a former colleague of both Matt's and myself, Dean Ball, has written quite extensively about this, about how to think through what is a kind of a regulatory pilot program, like opting out of traditional regulation to take on a new kind of regulation yourself in the context of an AI model developer. And so I think that's a really well taken point, and I think should be thought about more. Like we should be thinking more about what are novel governance kind of approaches to new and emerging technologies.
So we're getting ready to turn to audience Q&A, and while I let our mic runners kind of get into place, I want to ask our panelists just really briefly, one of the cool things about Josh's paper is that it really focuses on this question of what benefits might we have given up? We already heard some of this conversation around autonomous vehicles. I got to take my first Waymo ride earlier this year. It was amazing. I'm very excited for them to come to DC. I think a lot of us have had that kind of aha moment with generative AI products like ChatGPT or Google's Gemini, where we've used it to do something that would have taken us a lot of time. So what would you say that benefit that you're most excited about, either personally or professionally, when it comes to AI is? And Matt, I'm gonna go to the opposite direction down the line and put you on the spot first.
I think the technology, it's like one that we're all familiar with. Machine translation, undervalued completely. And I think people undervalue it because we've seen versions of machine translation, Google Translate, for like a decade now. But to me, this is like so exciting, because one thing that a huge problem in society, frankly, is that there's no translators on hand. There's not enough of them. And like for government services, for example, if you don't speak English, you walk into whatever office, you're not going to be able to talk to them. And so I think this technology is incredible. And whereas Google Translate's been around for a while, it's actually gotten really good and really accurate now. And a lot of the problems with people not speaking a language, if you tour another country or if you just live in America and you're one of the 69 million people who don't speak English, well, this is going to be huge for you. And I think this is going to open up so much life for a lot of people.
Tatiana?
Yeah, I think something that I'm actually really excited about, and I would consider myself a tech optimist, is actually the focus on bias. So human bias is extremely difficult to unprogram or de-learn, but with AI, we actually have very specific mechanisms to be able to do that. So I used to work at the Innocence Project, so they really focus on wrongful convictions, and the number one reason for wrongful convictions oftentimes is eyewitness misidentification. And so with the advent of facial recognition, of course, there was a lot of issues at the outset of it, literally decades ago, when it was starting to become more of a developed technology. Through a lot of research that was done through the National Institute of Standards and Technology, as well as other companies, it has gotten to a point where it is extremely accurate and does have the potential to be able to mitigate those wrongful convictions, which I think are a huge issue, and actually is really cool to be able to see if that was able to decrease. But at the same time, I'm sure a lot of folks have seen the different types of news articles of facial recognition software wrongfully identified somebody who was way across the state, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, we don't want that. And so it really just goes back to this just AI governance question. Like, we can't just rely on AI to do things. Like, we still need to make sure we're incentivizing good governance practices where all it would take was for somebody to cross-check if somebody was in the state or not to be able to do that. And it kind of goes to the point that to be able to scale AI and diffuse it effectively in our society, we do need a way to be able to implement it safely to gain that more consumer trust and make sure that folks do trust the technology.
Those are both two great ones. I think mine is going to be a little bit maybe tired, but I think, frankly, medical discovery and innovation. I think we've already seen there's a lot of some really good research out there about how we're already seeing researchers in labs, accelerate testing timelines, create kind of like novel evaluation tools, things that can, truly mean life and death, or, an extra 5, 10, 15 years for people, extending lifespans and making those lives better in the interim, I think is just totally, like, even though we can all say we understand how valuable it is, I really don't think we do understand how valuable that is.
Now I'd like to turn it over to our audience. Are there any questions in the room? And if you could please state your name and identify any affiliations.
Hello, my name is Louis Rothberg, and I'm just a retired guy. I'm not affiliated with anyone. Are you aware of something that's like the Uniform Commissioners of State Laws? For example, there's a Uniform Probate Code, and some states have adopted it. There's a Uniform Recognition of Acknowledgements Act, Uniform Commercial Code. And the states, by and large, follow the uniform model put out by these commissioners and some states tweak it, but most states don't. Do you know if there's those commissioners and that institution is working on some kind of uniform regulation of AI type law for the states to look to adopt? Because stopping the states from doing anything may not, with a moratorium, is one thing, but getting the states to enact a uniform code would be probably better in some ways. Or what do you think?
Yeah, I definitely agree. State coordination, I think, is key right now. I think that the Uniform Law Commission, ULC, has started to try to talk to state lawmakers about trying to create some level of uniform standards. Just we're so much in the preliminary stages of what that looks like, and there's so many different issue areas associated with AI that different lawmakers care about depending on their state, depending on their constituency, that, again, I think we're very much in the infancy, but it's a very good observation and certainly something that should be acknowledged.
I talked about this yesterday with somebody from the White House, and there is interest there in trying to somehow encourage this type of action. So the ideas are out there. It's just what form are we going to move forward on?
Yeah, I would echo both of those points, and I think soft law or kind of informal standard setting mechanisms can be really powerful and have been really beneficial to technology in the past. And so if that could be a complement or can be some kind of thing that can provide some guidance, I think I'd be encouraged to see kind of where that goes and what that does, but in the comparatively, how that tracks and what the speed, if we're looking at that versus what's happening at the state level, and does that really prevent some of the patchwork that we're seeing from emerging?
I'm going to turn to one of our online questions now. This question comes in from Stephen R. And the question is, what does this group think of the probability of doom in a less regulated world? Will AI amplify more good than bad in the future, or will it tip the scales the other way?
Well, I jump right in. I think it depends on what doom is. There's a lot of different things we could mean here. I think with any technology, there's no reason to assume there's not risk. This is a general purpose technology. I think Josh mentioned this earlier, right? It's going to be a double-edged sword. And I think in terms of concerns over doom or just any catastrophe that we could have as a result of these things, I think the best thing that we can be thinking about is how to enable our good actors to do the good things that they need to make sure things are safe. I mentioned earlier that I work on cyber policy. If AI can code, frankly, it can code malware, right? This is something we can reasonably assume. There's not a problem yet, but we could see an increase in cyber attacks if things are tipped the wrong way per the framing of the question. I think in terms of solutions and how to think about that, we should really be thinking critically, we shouldn't be obsessing over the criminals. We should be instead thinking, how do we unleash our defenders to use those coding abilities to fix vulnerabilities in our software before the attackers even have a chance to look at it. And I think if we do things like that, we'll have a much more prosperous, much more stable transition into this future.
Yeah, I unfortunately think it's a little bit of a philosophical question there, where AI is kind of just a accelerant of human behavior. So human behavior that's good will be accelerated exponentially. Human behavior that's bad will also be accelerated exponentially. So it is really just generally kind of what you think about the world. But I think the question of doom and catastrophic events generally is something that a lot of state policymakers and policymakers generally do look at. And I do wonder, if a event was to occur that was large, what are the ramifications of that? Does that mean that consumers all of a sudden stop trusting AI because of a catastrophic event? I don't know. But that could be a large hindrance to adoption and diffusion.
Yeah, I think there's quite notable folks who have been catastrophizing around the development of AI for quite some time. They've been wrong till now. I think they'll probably continue to be wrong in the future. I think what a catastrophe would be taking our eye off the ball and over-regulating technology now and preventing some of the beneficial outcomes, but also neglecting like real-world harms and things that are problematic today, or we already are having problems with legals. There are already plenty of existing problems that we can worry about solving. I think trying to spend too much time worrying about what is the one in pick your denominator scenario where something really, really goes badly. I think that's frankly a waste of time.
I think we probably have time for one more question before I pick another one from online. I want to see if there are any more questions in the room. Front over here.
Hi, my name is Ethan Tran. I'm just a WOE undergraduate intern on the Senate right now. But my question is regarding the 10-year moratorium. So I guess regarding like opportunity costs, how confident are we that in a 10-year period, the federal government would be a less stringent regulator of AI? I mean, I know the current administration is right now very friendly to it, but it seems like the coalition and that side of the aisle is very kind of weak. And the other side, it's also very ambient towards AI too.
So this is your question that over the 10 years, who do we see step in, fill the void of
Or
policy?
like, what do you think like politically the outlook's going to be in the 10-year period? Like, it's going to be, I guess after the 4-year term, it's going to be maybe have an opposite effect. But now the states can't regulate, and only the federal government is going to be the only player in the AI regulatory field.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's an important counterfactual to think about. I think my response would be that we kind of have to play with the cards that we've been dealt right now. And I think we're seeing right now AI is while it's all people want to talk about, it's also very fragile. Our lead against, I think if we think about our competition with China, largely technologically, AI is a huge part of that. I think doing what we can now to ensure that we continue to push ourselves out and continue to keep pace with the kind of technological development we've been seeing, I would personally bet that we can figure something out in the near term. There's a lot of folks in Congress who've been thinking about this quite deeply. And there's a lot of energy, I think, to do something. So.
Yeah, and just on the political point there, I think we shouldn't be thinking about who's in power in 10 years. The big point here is action on the federal level. And so it's not like legislating happens in 10 years. There's this window for federal legislation that I think with this in place, at least ideally, there would be an incentive to act that maybe wouldn't be there, but we'll see.
I think it's a super valid question. And I think even folks in the Senate have acknowledged that 10 years is a very, very, very long time for such a moratorium. And I do think that that is something that they're looking at for that time period. Specifically, I will say the thing that worries me maybe a little bit just based on my experience in data privacy is that Congress has mostly support for people wanting to do a federal data privacy law. We're the only G20 nation in the entire world that does not have a federal data privacy law. Been trying to do it for 20 years, have not accomplished it. And so that, I think, is a concern for me in the ability to come together on something that is such a hot button issue right now, like AI. And maybe coming together on data privacy actually solves some of this. But I do think that there is a mechanism to be able to do it, again, through privacy, through some of the agencies, if they're willing to kind of start taking baby steps towards it.
Well, we're running out of time, so I know there are more questions. We had some great questions come in online, and that there were more questions here in the auditorium we couldn't get to. There's more information about our panelists and their work online on the event webpage, as well as more information on the work that has been put out by Cato on AI policy, both at a state and federal level. But first, I'd like for you to join me in thanking our panelists for what was, I think, a very excellent conversation. This will conclude our policy forum on the opportunity cost of state AI policy. For those of you joining us in person, lunch will be available upstairs in the Policy Center. Thank you.